Hi, I'm Tom from Geometry. As Michael said, I did get rugged overnight by Justin Drake and also by John Charbonneau. And I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a giant ZK sandwich attack as well. So this is nothing to do with ZK, and this is Geometry really going off-piste a bit, and it's some very sort of hazy guesswork about the economic end state and maybe even computational end state of the Ethereum machine. So the things that I want to cover today, and I'm going to do this in 10 minutes. This has also had the scissors on it, so you can all go and enjoy the after-event party. The things I want to cover really are some infrastructure design principles that overlap with some sort of basic macroeconomic principles, and also how protocol builders can continue to be economically sustainable, which is going to be quite a difficult thing for people who are sort of building L2s now. It is the business options that they have ahead of them and the opportunity for economic surplus are massive, but you just got to stay on top of it, and I want to talk a bit about that too. So I'm going to give a quick kind of sanitized where are we in history right now account of Ethereum. Ethereum, and I want to, this is kind of applies to all L2s, but particularly I guess Ethereum was the sort of the first mover with the scaling problems it suffered first. There were some panic highlights, as I call them, including sharding, state rent, map reduce, lots of these things. How on earth are we going to scale this thing? This gave rise, obviously, to the production of layer 2s, and they all scratched their heads and thought, well, whilst we're doing this, we didn't, we have sort of mixed views on EVM, and we have maybe some other machines that would be interesting in trialing too. So let's try Cairo and Maiden and RISC-V and Noir. And then there's all these companies that are sort of tying the state, the balkanized state of these things, back to these L2s so that they can sort of reason about things that are going on in other chains. And of course, there's also the ZK bridges as well, doing the same thing between sort of L1s and L2s. So it's turned Ethereum into this massive virtual microchip factory. It's an accelerator. It's almost like a kind of, it's hosting a load of startups. So maybe this means long run, the layer one's job in this model, if it's the correct model, is something like mind your monetary stability, find cheap capital, validator capital, accumulate a lot of it, store things, and check proofs. So as far as the infrastructure goes, what game should we be playing at each layer? We've got the layer 1 and we've got the layer 2. The layer 1, I argue, and I think John and other sort of experts sit on the fence on this, but I think it is playing a macro game, and I don't think this is particularly controversial. It is after deep liquidity of the underlying asset, and I'm going to explain with some correspondence to fixed income markets why actually this is quite important. It's after deep liquidity, price stability, wide dissemination, wide handling of the asset, because this is going to affect its cost of operation. The layer 2 is playing a slightly different game in that it probably cannot get access to candidacy as a macro asset for the native asset. And so I think it is playing a slightly different game, and I'll explain all this in the talk. So here's some possible layer 1 design principles in the sort of hierarchy I think they should be addressed in. Number 1 is just do enough by returning cash flow through some sort of burn mechanism to the layer 1 asset so that you manage its supply. You make it a sort of plausible part of the monetary furniture. Then the next thing to do is take any additional surplus and make the aggregate number of dollars maximally available for security capital for validators. And then 3, aim for low APY on that validator capital. And you will probably, and I'll explain this a little later in the talk, but I think you will do best by that. A very good start is stabilize the layer 1 asset. That's the first thing you can do. And then the second is sort of make the maximum number of dollars of cash flow available to attract lots of that capital. Layer 1, and in particular the EIP 1509 debate, was really interesting. I don't know how many people have sort of braved Tim Roughgarden's 40-something page report on this. But aside from the analysis of the eventual design of 1509, there was additionally there was a sort of section towards the back with a load of other designs that might also have been looked at the same time. One known sort of rather grandly as the L-smooth mechanism. Essentially, take the fee that you're about to burn and don't burn it, and send it on to the sort of the stream of the next sort of L, the validators of the next L blocks. And if L is sort of big, then that means that the opportunity for collusion should remain relatively small. So I don't want to dwell too much on that, but I think we're about to revisit or have a sort of recapitulation of a similar argument in the context of MEV. Now, I've sort of tried to digest the post from Justin overnight and John's excellent thread on this. And John's thread is far subtler and far more educated than mine, than my analysis will be. But I'd like to actually run through what Justin sort of cites as the main motivations for going for a burn mechanism, which is, so this is kind of like the company buyback mechanism. You return the cash to the unstaked version of the token, not the staked version of the token. And what are the reasons for doing this? Well, one, interestingly, is there's a concept of sort of reducing the validator count a little bit. This is actually, there's a very specific reason that this might be beneficial, which is to promote single snop finality. There is a sort of sense that sort of increasing staking APR or sort of maintaining staking APR as a consequence. Well, I mean, really, I think markets, future markets, if there's a good primary function, if there's a good ability to put money into its validator form and then remove that money, that should be a good primary mechanism to make sure that the market's view of what a rational staker ought to be compensated will be reflected in that eventual APY, I should say. There is an argument around economic sustainability. So this is obviously looking forward to dank sharding, when we're going to have sort of severance of data. So not everyone will be storing all the data, but the data is going to be sort of somewhat sharded. Then there could be some revenue losses from that, and this is about sort of looking forward towards compensating for that. Tax efficiency, I'm less sure that should be a concern of a layer one protocol. So that's the kind of one of the ones I push back on. There is an argument towards economic scarcity. There would have been more economic scarcity of ETH, a higher net burn as a consequence of burning MEV, had this mechanism been in operation today. Again, I think sort of the deflationary asset, if that is ultimately the aim, is not necessarily the best way to promote an asset, either as an expression of validator capital, nor, which is the really important point, is can it support future fixed income assets, which includes credit systems. There's also an argument around trying unit of account and memetics. I think we can skip over those, but anyway, that's the argument that's kind of been the succinct arguments he's put around the MEV burn model rather than the MEV smoothing model, which I think was first proposed maybe sort of 2 years ago. So what about economic design at the layer 2? So can the layer 2 get a piece of this macro candidacy? I think it's a lot harder. It doesn't have canonicality in its L1. It's not actually sort of necessary to the creation of the layer 2 network that there should be a native asset. There is, ETH is there as an expression for denomination. So it doesn't have candidacy as a macro asset quite the same way. There's not that sort of canonical role that it's granted. There's actually no binding equivalent to the board shareholder relationship or any sort of source of value capture, of cash value capture we've seen historically that ensures that there is a constant truing up margin. It just kind of doesn't really exist. So I think that needs to be thought about a bit. It's typically metered by gas. There is some history around telecom companies, and as we saw, some people were using telecom companies' data to build sort of Skype. Not that that was necessarily in the end a great success story, but that certainly was an application that had the power to price discriminate between users. It could tell the difference between packets of data by definition in a way that the telecom couldn't. I suspect this is the layer 2 is closer to the telecom company at the moment, but MEV may be an exception to that. The other thing is protocols need to freeze. These mid-air reconstructions of the aircraft that are done sort of mid-air by protocols today. They can still happen, but they probably have to become more and more and more minimal, and you need to leave innovation to where security concerns, so sort of data availability guarantees, execution is being gradually loosened as you go up the layers of the infrastructure. And that's where you can probably afford to experiment, because you're probably not carrying the weight of business that is being carried ultimately by the layer 1 and layer 2. There's also, I think, a sort of sleepwalking sense for the community in which, well, this stuff is incredibly hard to build. It's required a huge amount of accumulated genius, and we've seen actually a lot of it on display today. A huge amount of accumulated genius to build these systems. But does that give us actually moral right of economic access to a return at the protocol layer? Big question. So the layer 2, I think, as much as anything, it's a matter of sort of psychology, and is the business and are these infrastructure businesses more widely prepared to just keep on looking for the trust residues that are left once they've done their amazing work? The ZKP sort of extinguishes a lot of the primitives of business economics that you're sort of used to trying to find in building some kind of business or service. But plenty is left. Arguably, the surface of utility actually widens, and there are lots of businesses you can build on top of this. I've listed some examples here. Just, we all know about the wallet. That sort of never goes away. Number 3, the developer platform. That's a kind of trust relationship that does not actually imperil the user's right of priority bearer access to their asset, but there is a sort of a role for sort of threat detection and deployment, migrations of user funds, migrations of smart contracts. That probably means that there is a long-term value extraction opportunity there. And then so number 2 is kind of weird. I don't think people. I'm calling this the virtual private computer, but there are 2 of these novel VMs that support private state. And this might be part of a route towards the sort of the final flourishing of our general migration to the cloud. So we've been gradually sort of walking off the edge of our physical hardware, and our computers are really sort of not physically sort of present where we think they are. A lot of the compute and the storage is actually going off chain. This, in some sense, could be the final flourishing of that, as you have a sort of fully validated ephemeral computer that's sort of that's running on something like a blockchain network. Of course, the difficulty with computational privacy can be, well, and we heard this earlier, I can't remember who said it, but there's sort of essentially more balkanization of state. It's more single player mode, and so sort of the questions then start to open, well, do we really need this on a sort of on-chain or in an off-chain environment? More generally, I'd sort of ask infrastructure companies to keep on looking for the pair business. So keep hold of your companies, don't dissolve them. You probably will need them. Obviously the end game for a lot of these protocols tends to be sort of wind up the company and the token goes out, and then it's got to sort of find its own economic way in the world. Seek the pair business. Lots of historic examples here. So the older one and the classic one, the one that all VCs like talking about, is MongoDB and MongoDB Inc. But there's also Next.js and Vercel. There's lots of kind of modern examples as well. The sort of the open source thing, the utility, and then the sort of the trust residue, the thing you need to provide to the user, and they come to depend on you, and this opportunity of value extraction. Which is not. Oh yeah. Okay, so I quickly want to return to a point I made about the macro asset and the stability of the asset and what the implications this has for validator capital. So a very basic theory of the rational staker is the validator return on investment is something like, it's a fixed income instrument, something like the fixed free rate, whatever that is, the slashing risk premium, which I think we all assume in the long run to be quite small, and then there's going to be some sort of FX risk premium. And you can see this in classical fixed income markets. These differences really do exist, and so corporates who issue debt in different currencies, and there are also even emerging market countries that will do kind of US denominated debt and sort of debt denominated in their own currency, and they often pay more for their own currency because it's less liquid, more volatile, less widely held. So this could mean that the moment a layer 2 or any piece of infrastructure decides to accept validator capital in, let's say, ETH versus its own token, you could end up opening up a 2-speed validator capital system. One with a tighter ROI and the other with a wider ROI. And this could even give rise to sort of virtuous and vicious circles. So for example, the higher ROI instrument is the one that the protocol wants to deprioritize. The reason is it doesn't attract as much validator capital for the same amount of security fee that's paid. And so that then becomes a less widely held asset, less liquid, it requires a higher premium, etc. And you can see the cycle go round and round. And on the flip side, you could end up with ETH becoming a more and more widely accepted expression of validator capital, and it enjoys the converse phenomenon. So quickly, here's the example of an emerging market country. Mexico for a long time, and I think still does have some USD bonds outstanding. And you saw this differential. You saw these extra premium. I'm not sure whether you can see it on that slide, but basically I've added in extra premium, extra returns. So between the 7% bond and the 8.5% bond, the extra return, the extra amount that the rational lender, the rational owner of the bond, needs to be compensated for holding the peso-denominated asset versus the USD-denominated asset. So here it's illustratively 150 bips. On the right-hand side, I've done an, again, illustrative example of what the layer 2 computation might be. So now, the reason I've equilibrated the left and right-hand sides of those types of I should say in the blue, by the way, that's the capital balance, and in the red is the sort of red and yellow is the income balance. So let's suppose that there is a really dramatic difference between the liquidity, the price stability of ETH, and the L2 asset. So we might see, I don't know, it could be a differential of 8% versus 3% return on the validator capital. Now, if we hold fixed, and this is a big assumption, but if we hold fixed somewhat the amount of fees that are available to the L2 stakers, and you equilibrate those, you can sort of see that the result of some sort of efficient rational staking market is you get 2.7 times, whatever it is, the amount of staked ETH for the same amount of security fee, and then for much higher efficiency for the level of security that you're providing to your users. I've called this, I talk about Jean Charbonneau a lot this talk. I'm calling it Charbonneau's return, which is this sort of ephemeral return that is due to the token holder, which is kind of if you're willing to be charitable and say this is sort of purchased sort of knowingly and with the expectation of bearing the costs of bootstrapping the system, there's all this kind of proof work that needs to be subsidized. And so you kind of need this ephemeral return to sort of get the system going. In the midterm, you then get the introduction, let's say, of ETH. And largely this might be because of competitive dynamics. Oh, wow, I need to be cheaper for the same level of perceived security. Obviously, there are lots of things that go into security, but one of them is how many security dollars are being posted against your L2 versus the other L2, because I don't want them going around saying they're more secure than I am. So I have to now accept ETH. And so that's the moment then you get the two-speed capital system, and then you get that potentially sort of vicious circle in the L2 asset. So again, this doesn't mean the L2s cannot make money. They certainly can. And I'm going to go into sort of how they can keep on to tracking value later on. I started to put together a value atlas. I don't think we're going to get through any of this. So I'll just say sort of bottom right. So generally, sort of I think for us sees more green than anything else. I'll just show you how this thing's constructed. So on the left, you can see those sort of purple boxes, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. So the idea of the differences between these is layer 1 moves to layer 2 through execution scaling, layer 2 moves to layer 3, let's say, through data availability scaling. Now, obviously, with danksharding approaching, it's going to take a lot of pudgy penguins to require possibly layer 3s immediately, but at some point they will be very, very relevant. And then along the top, you've got all of the sort of capital and service providers who might be engaged in the system. So from the kind of unstaked token on the left through to the capital provider / proposer, and I've put them essentially twice. One to sort of account for how big is the sort of the ultimate dollar market, and then the other is what is the ROI on the capital deployed into that market. You've then got builders, proof of farm, storage. And then you've got maybe the sort of the things that you won't have sort of maybe looked at or thought about quite so much before. Things like the virtual private computer, which I mentioned earlier, where that's kind of the environment in which, let's suppose, Maiden VM does not optimize for client-side proofs, and then you've got some sort of remote computation for all of your private transactions. Well, in such a situation, then there is a VPN-like role, perhaps even better for value extraction for the company that created the virtual machine in the very first place. They have that trust relationship with the user. Developer platforms, wallets, I think we know the sorts of things we mean by something that has a kind of a trust relationship. Anyway, I think we'll try and make this public, and then people hopefully criticize it and comment on it, and over time we can maybe improve it. Given time, I'm going to skip over this. kind of final thought, what are the crypto digital archaeologists going to find? Is the layer one EVM, is it sort of, not a wreck on the ocean bed, but is it sort of only relegated now to verifying proofs? That's one possible endgame for that. Does layer one MEV actually become more like a wholesale market? All the interesting MEV sort of travels down into the lower layers. Interested to sort of have some conversations with all the MEV folks here afterwards to hear about that. Will layer twos with layer one defined DA be enough sort of DA reduction following dank sharding to build quote unquote normal programs? And does the increasingly siloed execution environments of, let's say, layer threes, layer fours start to reduce MEV opportunities, and to what extent? So look, these are all just sort of questions. They're questions without answers. And I think that's really the extent of the talk. Thanks very much.